So I'm going a little bit incognito here for this video. I perhaps need to protect myself a little bit, given that I'm the only person who comes out to speak about these topics that are pretty much against popular public opinion at the moment. But I kind of had a quick listen to David McWilliams' podcast this morning on my walk, and after I'd listened to it, I shared some views and had a little bit of a rant on Instagram. Fair enough, most people that reached out to me actually shared some of my viewpoints and commended me in doing so. I put out a video at the weekend and other people rang me up and messaged me saying fair play for highlighting the issue and coming at it from a different point of view. However, when I asked people if I could share their opinion, they were very much unwilling to do so. Some quoted the fact that the Irish property market is a small market and didn't want to share their view or didn't want to get it out there what their view was. So I kind of feel that I'm alone a little bit in this, hence this outfit right now, but I will take this off in a minute. But I kind of feel that everyone is listening to David McWilliams and as an expert in the topic, and realistically, David McWilliams is not an expert in the topic. I generally kind of feel that most people are being fed a few lines, headlines in regards to this topic, and people like David McWilliams are taking advantage of that. David McWilliams is an economist, but he's certainly not an expert when it comes to property. Actually, just looking at his website, David, he's not a professor he's not a professor in economics, but he claims to be the 10th most influential economist in the world. Fair enough, that might be the case in terms of some of his books, but I definitely think there is plenty of PhD economic professors who are working out there. I'd imagine there's 10 professors in Harvard University alone that would rank themselves higher than David McWilliams, who contribute to academia constantly, where I'm not sure David has contributed much to academic research in economics point of view. And I'm sure there's plenty of economists that are professors working in Cambridge, MIT, just to mention a few. Also, there's plenty of Nobel Prize winners in the topic that certainly will find it hard to believe that David is ranked higher than they are. And also you have all the economic professors and professionals who work for the likes of the IMF, the World Bank, the Federal Reserve, the Central European Bank, that advise on policy that is far more influential than some books that David McWilliams puts out. So to claim that he's the 10th most economic influencers in the world, in my mind, is a bit of a stretch, but fair enough, he can claim what he wants to. Realistically, David McWilliams, in my mind, is a journalist at this point and has been for the last 20 years. He's good at his job. He certainly knows how to grab people's attention. Something worth noting, David McWilliams' media company made over 600,000 in accumulated profits last year, and that's his media company. It's an important phrase to remember because realistically he has been a journalist and has been a journalist for the last 20 years, more so than contributing to any economic research. David McWilliams knows his income is based on the fact that people are willing to listen to him. Therefore, he puts out stuff that he knows will grab people's attention and doesn't really provide any major solutions to any of the problems that we face here in Ireland. Granted, I think David McWilliams does want a better Ireland, and I commend him for that. I think most people do. I think everyone really does want a better Ireland. I do believe David McWilliams is a positive impact for Ireland, and definitely some of his ideas are worth thinking about. None of his ideas are that new or that revolutionary, but definitely where he takes ideas from other cultures and other countries and suggests that they can be brought into Ireland, he is right in a lot of those regards. And I want a better Ireland. I think most people do, and most people do want more houses, etc. in Ireland. However, a lot of the ideas that David McWilliams puts forward in his podcast or sometimes in his news articles, there's very little substance behind that in terms of actually making those ideas a reality, and it seems that he doesn't quite understand the markets that he is talking about, and particularly when it comes to property, he doesn't understand the fundamentals behind development and what is driving the development and what is causing the problems. So I'm going to start listening to the podcast now and comment as I go, both positive and negative in terms of some of his ideas and how they can work or how even to improve some of his ideas. So I'm going to leave the shades and the hoodie on just to speed through this and listen to the podcast, but I also think it's important to remember that I do seem to be the only person out there who is sharing a view from both sides, and I am sharing it from both sides. I want people to get on the housing ladder. I want more people in houses. Everyone should be able to get on the housing ladder. I have clients that I help all the time try get them at their first house, as well as their second and third and investment property. So I have clients from multiple different areas. I amn't representing any major REITs or funds at the moment, so anyone who wants to pile pressure on me because I'm supporting that side, it's wrong. I'm really supporting the fact that I think they will help drive development, and we need them to drive development. So that's where I'm coming from. But I question why I'm the only person who is out there saying these kind of things, and I think it is because anyone else from a professional background, from the researchers in CBRE or researchers in Jones Lang, etc., who have probably far more data and far more information than anyone like David McWilliams would have, are unwilling to probably go anywhere near the media because they don't want to be criticised, or they don't want their company being dragged through the mud, and they don't want any of the funds that they represented to be highlighted. So I kind of feel that I'm out here on my own doing this. And while I do get a little bit of negative kickback from some people, generally speaking, actually, I've got quite a positive feedback from most people. Hence why I'm still doing it, and I'm not ducking back under the covers. But let me get on with this podcast, and we'll see how we get on. Okay, so David McWilliams starts off the podcast talking about Vulture funds and REITs, etc., coming into Ireland back in around 2010 or so, buying up major chunks of property. And realistically, he kind of describes it reasonably okay in terms of what actually happened. NAMA had 80 billion worth of loans on their portfolio, and they had to get rid of it somewhere. No one in Ireland had 80 billion lying around, so therefore they had to go to the international markets. And vulture funds, as you call them, or cuckoo funds, and REITs, etc., all came in. Generally speaking, any of the REITs that came in here were for the long term, but he is right in kind of what he refers to as some of the vulture funds or cuckoo funds coming in for the short term. And realistically, the Irish government knew that they'd be coming in for the short term, because it is a short term fix, because we needed to sell these loans to someone. However, what David completely and utterly misses to mention is that there was capital allowance grants to people, or these funds that came in and bought, if they held on to the property for a number of years. Therefore, there was a positive growth for any fund that held property for a number of years from a capital gains point of view. And that has disappeared, something that David doesn't mention whatsoever in his commentary. That capital gains incentive has disappeared, and once it disappeared, or once that timed out, a huge amount of the cuckoo funds that he calls them, or venture funds that he calls them, actually left Ireland, and they made a handsome profit and they left, but they sold most of their portfolio onto funds that are looking at long-term investment. And I think he has missed that point. Most of the funds that are actually here at the moment aren't looking at short-term gains, they're looking at long-term rental income over the long term. So David McWilliams then leads on to the fact that these funds are still here in Ireland, and it's ridiculous that they're still here in Ireland and we don't need them. I think he's completely missed the point here in this. We definitely do need them, and I think a lot of people are missing the point in this argument, and I've made it a few times. We still have a rental crisis. Once people go back to work, we will have a rental crisis, and we will need rental stock for people who want to move into the city, work but don't want to buy because they're only going to be here for a few years, etc. We will have that demand, and one way to facilitate that demand is through these large funds and REITs that are looking to stay here for the long term. If they're here for the long term, they give security for the tenants that are in situ, because you don't have to worry about your small-time landlord who is looking to sell their house or move their aunt or brother or whoever, or daughter or whatever, into the house at some stage when they go to college, etc. You don't have to worry about that in these situations, because once you're there, there's very little that they'll be able to do in terms of removing you, unless you are actually breaking some of the lease covenants. David talks about why they shouldn't be here anymore, but I definitely feel there is a need for them, there is a market need for them, and there's a society need for them to provide these units, these rental units within the city centre. Ireland is so underdeveloped in terms of our professional letting services that we offer to residents within the city. Granted, not all of these developments have to be rental accommodation, but there is a need for them. David then goes on to basically reference the Irish property market to a Ponzi scheme. And he really lost me on this, and it really frustrated me. A Ponzi scheme is where someone who controls a fund will deliberately manipulate their accounts to show that their fund is showing a very large profit in order to attract new investment in. What they're doing is illegal. Bertie Madoff, or whatever his name is serving 140 years in prison for running these type of schemes, and it's a completely illegal scheme because the person who is controlling the scheme has to manipulate the figures to show that there is a profit being made when there is massive losses actually happening. And by them manipulating the figures, they attract new investors in, and when those new investors come in, they pay off some of the original investors with a small, nice profit. Because those original investors got a small, nice profit, they're willing to put their money back in. And that's the whole cycle of a Ponzi scheme that actually happens, but it never makes any money. And what actually is happening is someone is manipulating the books and manipulating the figures. David also explains that the Irish property market has experienced ongoing returns for nearly 30 years. How, in the same breath, does David McWilliams call the Irish property market a Ponzi scheme when he also in the same breath says that it has showed positive returns for nearly 30 years? That's not the same thing. It's quite clear that the Irish property market has been very, very lucrative and has shown incredible returns over the last 30 years. Something a Ponzi scheme never actually does. A Ponzi scheme never shows real returns. I understand where he's coming from in terms of trying to link the two of them together. However, I think from an economist point of view, it's a very tentative link, and I think it's just purely for a soundbite, for David to get a soundbite and to get something put in the press. And I think that's all that's behind that. It's not good economics, and it's not a good reference either. Now we're talking about kind of vulture funds, or funds coming in and buying up housing estates or buying up one block of apartment, and that developers love the ability to sell to one fund. That could be true. That probably is true in a lot of cases. It's a lot easier. He then goes on to mention that estate agents love it as well, and solicitors love it as well, because they only have to sell to one person versus selling to 100 people, and solicitors only have to sell to one person versus having to draw up 100 contracts, and they make the same amount of money. David's wrong in this. David is definitely wrong in this, and it shows his lack of understanding within the property market. However, in a huge amount of cases, an agent will be paid a quarter or a half of what they would have been paid. There's no developer out there that's going to pay them the exact same amount for selling to one individual fund versus 300 individuals. Any developer who goes out there and agrees a deal that they're paying them the same amount has lost their mind, and I don't think there's many developers out there that are that stupid to not negotiate with agents, because agents will take a massive cut on that if they're only selling to one person. And from solicitors, if solicitors are only drawing up one contract, again, they're not being paid the same amount either. David then goes on to call REITs snake oil stuff or whatever. I'm not quite sure what he's getting at, but there are 3 listed REITs in Ireland, and to call them snake oil stuff, they have to go and get listed on the stock exchange. There's huge requirements around them. Fair enough, they may not pay a huge amount of tax in terms of what they get in rent. However, they are required to pay out a huge amount of dividends every year, and those dividends, i.e. the shareholders, the owners of those REITs, will have to pay tax on those dividends. Generally speaking, if they're an Irish resident, 33%. So the claim that they don't pay tax, again, David completely and utterly skips over this point and doesn't quite realise what REITs are. A huge amount of my pension fund, your pension fund, teachers, doctors, everyone's pension funds are wrapped up in these vehicles that are buying these properties. If you've got a pension with Davies, Irish Life, Aviva, and there's a list goes on, they have huge property assets here. While those pension funds have the ability not to pay any tax on the rent that they collect, you and me have the same ability to do that if we buy a property through our pension. You don't pay any tax on any income that you put into your pension while you're working, and you don't pay any tax on any of the gains made within that pension until you start withdrawing from your pension fund when you retire. That's the same principle that these large funds are working on. So David goes on to talk about providing a bond for housing, to develop housing. I think this is where he misses the point again and shows his lack of understanding of the market. Funding is not the issue. There's lots of funding out there. There's lots of international funds that want to invest in Ireland. So funding is not the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is that a lot of the schemes, particularly apartment schemes, are not feasible at the moment. There is a huge amount of objections going in from councillors and TDs. They're delaying housing coming onto the market, and there is definitely issues with our design standards in terms of, I think on average our design standards are 30% larger than across Europe, which makes them 30% more expensive to build. There's other issues that our design standards are very limited, and developers are very tied into what the design standards are, and there's very little flexibility there. But I'm not quite sure how David's proposal of a bond works for an overall market. I understand it, how it works from a social housing point of view. The government take a large bond and build a huge amount of social housing and provide social housing for the people who need social housing. However, I'm not quite sure everyone in Ireland wants to live in a social house. I presume a huge amount of the population want to actually live in the private market and want the ability to buy their own home. Providing a bond, David never explains this, but he doesn't quite explain how providing a bond will benefit the private market. Fine, there could be a bond there that every developer could apply for it and get finance, but as I've said before, finance is not the major issue here in Ireland. If they set up that bond and developers can apply for finance, who regulates that? Who says what profit you can make from a certain development? Will that limit developers wanting to apply for it? There is plenty of schemes out there right now provided by the government that developers can apply for financing through the government. Very few developers actually opt for this. So why would we think developers in the private market would opt for it right now? Development is very complex, and building large mixed-use schemes or large shopping centres or large office complexes is a complex task, and not many people in the world have the expertise to deliver huge development schemes. So I think if international funds are willing to come in here with their expertise and their funds to develop, I don't see a major issue with that, considering we need as much houses as we possibly can, and we need offices and etc. and everything else. But telling them, goodbye, here's our national anthem, you've had a few drinks, now leave the party, I think would be an incredibly naive thing to do, and to think that we would recover and be able to build enough houses quickly would be naive. I think we do need them, we do need their expertise, and we need them for a functioning economy. So this has been a little bit of a different video for me today. If you've liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, you can give it a thumbs down. You'll screw up my algorithm, but fair enough, some people won't like this video. But if you are interested in property or an alternative viewpoint on the odd kind of topics that come up when related to property, please hit that subscribe button, and thanks a million for watching.